Are y'all ready? Thank you. All right. Hey, good evening, everybody. Good evening. It is a delight to welcome you all to St. Stephen's for this conversation on the intersection of faith and science, and what must have been a very catchy title, A Priest and a Scientist Go to Antarctica. I am not the first person to celebrate the Eucharist in Antarctica. I was disappointed to find that out when I went, but I did celebrate the Eucharist, something that I'm not sure I know any other clergy that can say they have done on that continent. Delighted to welcome you all. Grateful for Jim McClintock's invitation to join him in Antarctica, and it may be as important as ever to have these conversations of the intersection of faith and science, especially in a kind of complicated time right now, to have important conversations. That is not what this conversation is about. This is about the intersection of faith and science in Antarctica, but I recognize that. So thank you all for being here. I'm a person that begins with prayer, so the Lord be with you. Gracious and loving God, open our eyes to see your creation and to take seriously the responsibility to care for it. Amen. With a global population of nearly 8 billion people, there are few places left in the world as sparse and desolate and extraordinary as Antarctica. In December, I was invited to join our parishioner, Dr. Jim McClintock, to make the 7,000-mile trek from Birmingham to the Antarctic Peninsula, to learn about Jim's research, to be inspired by the white continent, to add another theological voice to the growing concern by scientists of the rapidly changing climate, more evident in Antarctica than most places in the world. Jim spent nearly 4 decades as a scientist in Antarctica, earning an exceptionally rare honor. The end of a 3-mile stretch of the coast of Antarctica is named McClintock Point in honor of his impact to scientific research on this continent. And since I have some Bailey family here that are tuning in from New England, in some weird, bizarre confluence, it's about 20 miles from a Nuntuck, which is a mountain that grows through a glacier that's named after my great-aunt Ursula. You think there's, God weaving things together, if that's not evident of that. Jim's a much more entertaining and engaging speaker than my Aunt Ursula was, but both hugely impact in science. Tonight we want to show you the vast beauty of God's creation and to reflect upon the beauty theologically and scientifically. Coming into an awareness of the grandeur of God should not only inspire us, it should change us too. It should change us to care more deeply about what God has inspired, what God has formed of this earth, our shared home and the life that shares it. Isn't that just being faithful? To recognize God's creative beauty and treat it as so. This is our hope, that you leave curious, inspired, and maybe even changed. Our trip began in Buenos Aires, one of the traditional stops of the touristic expeditions that make their way south. We happened to be there on a Sunday, and as our hotel was only a few kilometers from the Anglican Cathedral of Argentina, I took the opportunity to worship in a familiar way. On Sunday morning, I was surprised to see a recognizable face in the worshiping congregation. The former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, the Most Reverend Catherine Jeffords Shorey, and her husband were 2 of the 30 or so gathered for worship that morning. Bishop Shorey, whose career before the Episcopal priesthood was of a marine biologist, had traveled south to visit Antarctica too. Interested in learning more about climate change, that's been her focus since her retirement. They had circled the Drake Passage, the challenging body of water between Antarctica and South America, for several days before their ship's captain made the decision not to cross. Extreme weather had made their journey unnavigable, an ironic reminder of the growing inconveniences caused by unpredictable and extreme weather. Our passage through the Drake was much easier, a 2-day journey that was rather uneventful. On our way through the Drake Passage, Jim gave a lecture about Antarctica and how it's changing. Towards the end of the lecture, he shared that he made the journey with an Episcopal priest, part of his efforts to help people understand and take seriously what is happening not only to our climate, but impacting the very nature of our home. Much of Jim's research has been about drug discovery on the seafloor, and changing climates can impact what God has created, and science has helped us harness to care for the well-being of each other. After the lecture, one of the people we had gotten to know came up to me with a serious question. John, how do you make sense of science in Scripture? I mean, the Bible says there's a man named Adam and Eve, but you believe in climate change and evolution. It just seems so incompatible to me. We talked for a while, and it was a helpful launching place for what I suspect there are many others who were in that room who discount the Christian faith because of their own assumptions of the tenets of what at least this tradition holds. An exceptionally small number of Episcopalians are literalists, but we are believers. I stood in my ordination and I stated in front of a congregation that I believe the Holy Scriptures of the New and Old Testament to be the Word of God and to contain all things necessary to salvation. And I believe that we can be believers, and yet being faithful has to parse out what is true and what is historical. There are huge fundamental differences with the weight of our conversation which science hinges on. How many others see faith and science as incompatible conversation partners? Something I wonder more and more every day. And so an example, in the first chapters of Genesis, the beginning of Christian and Hebrew scriptures, 2 different creation stories are told. And as I looked at my friend that was asking me about this, I shared that, all of us know that if we were to place every single child born, every child born in a room with every toy made, and then we shared that in the kitchen back there's something in there that they can never have. Every child is going to spend the rest of their life trying to get in that kitchen. The story of Adam and Eve is a story that conveys a truth that is it transcends history. It's the why question. As far as we know it, the oldest hominins are thought to have appeared nearly 7 million years ago, with Homo sapiens appearing around 192,000 years ago. So these stories don't have to be true in a historical way to speak a powerful truth about the nature of humanity. She listened. I think she was hooked, and I'm hoping that maybe she's found an Episcopal church by now, 2 months after we've returned. But if we believe the Bible to be true, it has real implications for how we understand the world and our role in God's creation. Scripture, especially the first 11 chapters of Genesis, don't exist to convey a historical account of creation of the earth, but to teach us about the nature of God, the Creator, and to learn more deeply about the nature of humanity and how God intends us to live. And so it's these first 11 chapters that I'm going to explore with you as we journey south. In the first chapter of Genesis, we learn of a Creator that has intentional order and structure. The Bible begins, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep. While a wind from God swept over the face of the waters, then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." And can you imagine a wind so strong that creation is manifest? This spirit, or in Hebrew, ruach, is the breath of God that moves over everything. So when we're on the ship, every morning a soft and gentle Brazilian dialect would come over the speakers of our ship, and Susanna would share instructions for the day or comments on our excursion, and there was one word that she refused to say out loud. She would say W-I-N-D. It is in the southernmost continent that wind takes a new shape. A temperature of 35 degrees Fahrenheit can become instantly intolerable due to extreme wind. We visited as summer was beginning, and for the most part, we had really good weather. But when the wind picked up, it was like nothing I had experienced before. A wind so powerful it can change the face of what we experience, a wind that shows the creative power of God. What strikes me most in the first chapter of Genesis is the structure of the world. There is a symmetry in order. The first 3 days, God creates light and sky and water. In the next 3 days, God creates heavenly lights, waters, and sky animals. Land animals and humans with plants as food. It's the water that brings forth swarms of living creatures, and it's the earth that brings forth the living creation of land. And when God makes humanity, he gives humanity dominion over the fish and birds and cattle and all the creeping things, as we often translate. There is order and structure. Now, the question I've been asked several times, John, did you see any polar bears? There are no polar bears in Antarctica. Polar bears have evolved over the last 250 million years, and Antarctica broke away from South America probably 300 million years ago, so we have no polar bears. Now, conversely, do you know why there are no penguins in the Arctic? Anybody? Because there's polar bears. The implication, there are no land predators on the continent. The result is penguins flourish, and they have no boundaries. On our trip, we were instructed not to get any closer than 15 feet, but as we were also reminded, the penguins don't know any better. The elephant seals don't know any better. But I share this because we understand that there's a hierarchy in the natural world. Krill flourish in Antarctica. Penguins and whales flourish off the abundant krill. Leopard seals and orca whales flourish off the abundance of penguins. And man is clever enough to make a home in the most inhospitable of conditions. However, there's always a reminder that humanity is not the greatest force in the world. The order of the universe shows that creative intuition and order that God establishes in the universe, but it's still God's universe. Humans don't have supreme reign. In Genesis chapter 11, humanity builds a tower to the heavens. Often uses a story that explains the myriad of languages that fill our earth. I find the emphasis on technology to be more compelling. We hear in 11:3, "Come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly." God's people have discovered a new way to build, a new technology. And what do they do with that new technology? They build a tower to the heavens. We humans have always gone beyond what we should have. Our technology advances much faster than our ethical understanding of the implications. The human quest to chart and discover probably stems from our God complex. We are inherently curious people driven by ego. One of the excursions, we headed on a Zodiac cruise around Enterprise Island, a small island that's about 1.5 miles long. First charted in 1898 on the Belgian Antarctic expedition under Adrien de Gerlache. In the 1900s, the island was used by whalers, a major whaling destination from 1916 to 1930. As we took the Zodiac tour around, we came to the remnants of a large whaling vessel, the Governorin. Is that right? How in the world have I've missed? I've given y'all too many slides. I didn't put my notes in. Okay. With the bow above the water, the large steel structure stands as a reminder of the human quest to push to the most extreme of climates, to gain some advantage, to extract some worth or meaning. The boat rests as a reminder that we cannot conquer everything. This is also apparent at Whalers Bay, a recent active volcano discovered by American and British sealers in the 1820s. From a distance, the bay looks like a donut with a small bite taken out of it, which allows boats to enter. When arriving in the bay, steam actively rises off the water, heat from the active volcano. What stands out is the remains of whaling stations that were ultimately abandoned when the volcano erupted 3 times in the late 1960s. Technology. We try to build higher and higher or reach farther and farther away to inhabit space or Antarctica. I wonder if we see ourselves as God. The story of the Tower of Babel lived out over and over again. In the 2nd chapter of Genesis, a new story of creation begins. In this story, God has a different name. And in our tradition, we read the New Revised Standard Version, which refers to God as Lord God in chapters 2 through 4. Where in the first chapter, we gain a sense of the vast expanse of God, of a God that is far away, creating structure and order in the universe. It's the Lord God's creation story that there's this intimate relationship between humanity and God. The story takes place in a garden with God being close and personal. I'm struck at the paradox of Antarctica. Often looking out at the vast glaciers and icebergs, it's hard to grasp the scale of creation. It shapes our worldview to gaze upon that which we struggle to comprehend. I imagine it's a similar feeling to peering off into the Grand Canyon to see what millions of years have shaped. And yet, when one makes a continental landing, they come face to face with the Antarctic wildlife. It feels as if one has entered a sacred garden to be in relationship with the beautiful inhabitants of this continent. On our journey, we encountered 3 of the 8 species of penguins. On our first landing, we encountered the Adelie penguin, one of the smaller breeds of penguins seen mostly breeding in October through February on the shore of the continent. In a place where there are no land predators, our encounters elicit feelings like sitting in the Garden of Eden, where creation lives in harmony and balance. The penguins march by our human presence, unfazed by our existence. The penguins coexisting with giant elephant seals and pestrels nesting just beyond. As we touched down on land, walking amongst the penguins and seals, each visitor was given special boots and pants and was required to walk through a biofilm material to protect the wildlife and to keep the island as clean from human contamination as possible. A reminder of how fragile some elements of life can be. There's a real need to protect wildlife from viruses and bacteria. Just 2 weeks ago, king penguins died from the H5N1 bird flu, a startling discovery in the past few weeks. Later excursions brought in contact with chinstrap penguins, which are capable of scaling rocky cliffs, and the Gentoo penguins, which can grow up to 3 feet tall, the larger of the 3 breeds. When we landed at Palmer Station, the United States Science Station operated by the National Science Foundation, we encountered both Gentoo and Adelie penguins. In the 1970s, there were 16,000 breeds of Adelie. When we arrived this December, there were 1,100 breeding pairs. although many Gentoo penguins have begun to overtake what was historically an Adelie rookery. One of the more well-known stories in the Bible is the story of Noah. Most Christian theology has focused on the covenant that God establishes with Noah. We meet Noah towards the end of chapter 5, and chapter 6 begins, "The Lord saw the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth," with only Noah winning God's favor. The story has it that Noah builds an ark, puts 2 of every creature on the ark, and then a giant flood wipes out all of creation, giving a chance to start over. God promises to never destroy every living thing. And lore has it that the rainbow is a reminder of God's promise. But there's another element of this story that's worthy to explore. The actions of humanity have implications for all of creation. All of the animals are wiped out, except for those on the ark. The land is flooded, the lakes are filled, the mountains are washed with rain. 40 days and 40 nights it pours. Our human actions, at least in the Old Testament, have environmental consequences. Some changes might be natural, but theology backs up the scientific claim that our human actions have impacts larger than ourselves. In the story of Jonah in chapter 3, Jonah is commanded to go and proclaim a message of repentance to Nineveh. Jonah goes and cries out, 40 days more and Nineveh shall be overthrown. The king hears this and is moved. He covers himself with sackcloth and sits in ashes, this biblical model of repentance. And then he declares a proclamation. By the decree of the kings and his nobles, no human being or animal, no herd or flock shall taste anything. They shall not feed. And the animals shall be covered in sackcloth. Animals having to pay the consequences of human behavior. Antarctica is changing, and the implication from these changes will affect you and me. 7,000 miles away. But we're all citizens of this great planet. And what happens in Antarctica can be felt around the world. I think I was supposed to be showing you these pictures. But now I'm going to invite Jim to share his thoughts. And then I will come back and wrap things up, and then we'll take questions. I feel like I should probably say, you can disagree with whatever I say. This is St. Stephen's. I feel like it's probably important to say that.
Thank you, sir. It's going to be hard to follow such eloquent words. Thank you for that. Many of you know I've worked in Antarctica for many decades, 4 now. And the last 2 decades were at Palmer Station that John just mentioned. And I want to tell you about a day, probably 10 years into living at Palmer Station. The Mar Glacier is a beacon for those of us that want to get away, be by ourselves, look at the beautiful views. And I hiked up the glacier, and suddenly I found myself hearing something I'd never heard before. I heard running water. And I looked down, and there was a stream running underneath the ice. And it really set me back. It was a moment, one of those moments where you think, goodness, something is changing. Well, I knew from having been living here that the glacier itself had been more active. It used to calve once or twice a week, and it had been dropping big chunks of ice 3 or 4 times a day. No more excitement about that big chunk of ice. It was part of the background noise. We measure this. We've measured this retreat of the glacier by having somebody with a GPS do a hike along the leading edge of the glacier, talking to a satellite overhead, and coming back and adding another line to the glacial map showing its retreat over time. We've never lost anybody doing that. They've always come home. But it's remarkable how much retreat there has been. So the glaciers are retreating. In fact, about 90% of the glaciers along the 800-mile length of the Antarctic Peninsula on the western side are retreating measurably. And we also have been seeing ice shelves breaking out. Now, ice shelves, for those of you that don't remember, are these chunks of ice that are attached to the land. They're about 1,000-foot deep ice, and they're quite substantial. And I want to show you two that have quite a history. One is the Larsen B ice shelf. Now, this satellite image was taken on January 31st, 2002. And note the striations in that thick ice. You can see the cracks, if you will. A month later, it began to break up and go out. And 2 weeks later, in March, it really did break up and go completely out. So this is a chunk of ice about the size of the state of Rhode Island that has floated away from the western Antarctic Peninsula. More recently, in 2017, a big chunk of the Larsen C ice shelf developed a crack. And you might remember in the evening news that crack. It was all over the world's news. They came back and they kept following the crack, and eventually the crack opened up, and that chunk of ice floated away. This chunk of ice was the size of Delaware. And it was the largest, one of the largest icebergs that had ever been recorded in human history. So there's good news and there's bad news about these ice shelves. The good news is that basic physics, as my son would say, he would say that if you take a chunk of ice and you put it in a glass of water, when that ice melts, the water doesn't come over the top of the glass and spill onto the table. It's the same idea. This 1,000-foot ice is floating in the ocean, so when it melts, it doesn't affect sea level. So that's a good thing. However, the concerning news from people that work on these things is that the ice shelves themselves are effectively barriers. They're barriers to the movement of the ice sheets. Now, what is an ice sheet? The ice sheet is that massive chunk of ice, 2 to 3 miles thick, that sits on 95% of the Antarctic continent. That's where about 80% of our fresh water on this planet is locked, is in that ice. That ice is not just sitting there, it's actually moving. On the western side of Antarctica, it's moving to the west, and on the eastern to the east. And so what's happening is as these ice shelves are disappearing, the rate of movement of the ice into the ocean is accelerated. Now, ice sheets, when they enter the ocean, do affect sea level rise. They are actually having an effect on the west end of Dauphin Island, if you've been down there. They are having an effect on global sea level rise everywhere. And it's part of the equation, if you will, of how much sea level we're going to have. Antarctica is going to be a big part of that. So, as John mentioned, the wildlife of Antarctica, it is a spiritual experience. It really is. And they have not read the Antarctic Treaty. And it's just wonderful. But this is a story that's probably one of the most poignant stories of how climate change is really changing things quickly. Bill Fraser, a friend of mine from Montana, came to Palmer Station as a graduate student in 1974. And for his doctoral project, Bill put tags on 16,000 breeding pairs of Adelie penguins. Now, that is a doctoral project, isn't it? Even more astonishing is that Bill came back every year for almost 50 years and followed that population of 16,000 breeding pairs. And as John mentioned, the news is not good. Last year, there were only 1,100 penguins left in that colony, period. And because we're going up and down the coast and scientists are looking at the other penguin colonies, we know they're not moving. They're actually disappearing. So why is it that Bill's penguins are having such a difficult time in this changing environment? Well, one thing is the weather's changing. We always get kind of confounded between weather and climate, but the weather is changing pretty dramatically on the peninsula. We're going from a cold, dry, polar environment to a wetter, more humid subantarctic environment. The air is more humid. It means that it's snowing more and later than it used to. The Adelie penguin doesn't have the luxury to adjust its schedule. Its genome is essentially programmed to show up at the same time every year and lay their eggs. So they come in to the islands in front of the station, they lay their eggs, and then along comes an unseasonable snowstorm and covers the colony. And sadly, while it doesn't affect the adults, the eggs don't survive when the meltwater occurs. So you can lose an entire generation of Adelie penguins in these unseasonable storms. Now, there's another thing going on besides this that Bill thinks important. I haven't mentioned yet that Antarctica has this amazing clock. It's the sea ice. Sea ice is about 5-foot deep ice that doubles the size of Antarctica every winter and then breaks up and goes away in the summer. The ebb and flow of that ice is so predictable that there is wildlife that have adaptations to the sea ice. We call them sea ice adapted species. The Adelie penguin is one of them. What do they use the sea ice for? Well, they get down on their bellies and they toboggan across the sea ice. Miles and miles to the edge of the ice, they jump in the water, and then they're very close to the krill, the shrimp, it's the base of the food webs of Antarctica, that provide their nourishment. The problem with having to swim much further now, because the sea ice is disappearing, is they have to spend a lot more energy swimming than sliding. And so Bill thinks that they're on a very tight energy budget to feed their chicks, and this is having a negative effect on the populations. So sea ice is critical, absolutely critical to many species, and we'll explore that a little bit more. One species that sea ice is very important for, and we just found this out within the last 20 years, is that when krill, the quintessential base of the food web, is a teenager, a krill lives under the sea ice. It uses it for a refuge and it uses it for food. There are tiny little plant cells called diatoms that grow under the sea ice that the krill are grazing. So as the sea ice is disappearing, the populations of krill are being affected by that. And this has a big consequence if krill starts to really become depleted because so much life depends on krill. The baleen whales, for example, these beautiful humpback whales. I was so hoping that John would get to see bubble feeding. This is an amazing phenomenon. When the ship comes up on 3 or 4 humpback whales that are taking big breaths and diving down 50 feet and blowing bubbles to create a cylinder of bubbles, what that does is it scares the krill into a ball. And then the whales take turns going to the bottom of the cylinder and coming right up with their mouths open. They come out of the water. You can see the krill being sieved over the baleen. People are crying and screaming, and it's just absolutely phenomenal. There is some good news about whales, despite the krill issue. The whale biologists in Antarctica are now convinced that the hunting of whales, it's late 1800s, early 1900s, was so, successful, I guess would be the word, that it has taken over 100 years for the populations to really become reestablished. And they think that they may have hit a critical number that they're beginning to take off in a good way. The numbers are up. So that's very nice to see. So other species that could be affected by the loss of the sea ice. I love this story. This is my favorite seal in Antarctica. It's a Weddell seal. It's a beautiful species. And it has the most amazing adaptation. The female has ice-chipping teeth. And when she's pregnant, she uses those ice-chipping teeth to chip at the ice, under the sea ice, until she has a hole that's large enough that she can crawl up onto the ice and give birth. Her pup now completely safe from the leopard seals, the killer whales that are out at the ice edge, and all because of her dentition, if you can imagine. As the sea ice is disappearing, the question is, where are Weddell seals going to go? She's not going to have that way of keeping her pup safe. Will they go to shore and give birth? We don't know. Will they follow the sea ice as it retreats? We don't know. We also don't know what's going to happen to the top predator in Antarctica. Now, I have been on 15 cruises, annual cruises to Antarctica. Some of you have been with me. And most of the cruises, we get to see a leopard seal. That's really, really fun. Boy, did we see a leopard seal on this last cruise, didn't we? We saw a leopard seal hunting a penguin, and that was, this was not Disney. This was the real tooth and claw of nature. Despite their reputation for being aggressive, territorial, scaring us to death when we're scuba diving, and getting us out of the water so we don't get in trouble, they are beautiful animals, and they have never ever been seen giving birth anywhere but on the sea ice, on an ice floe. So nobody knows what's going to happen. Are they going to go to shore in the absence of sea ice and give birth on shore? It's possible. There aren't really any predators they have to worry about too much. Or will they follow the sea ice? Lots of unknowns. We just don't know. Now, if you look at the seafloor of Antarctica and the marine life that lives there, it's unique. It's not like the temperate and tropical areas of our planet. It happens to be very, very, very old. This happened because Antarctica separated from South America about 40 million years ago. And about 20 million years ago, give or take a few million, the Antarctic Current was established, the largest current on the planet that goes in a clockwise direction around Antarctica and essentially locked the continent into a deep freeze. So the species that could adapt to the cold have done so. Many of them didn't. So what you have essentially is the absence of some conspicuous groups. There are no sharks in Antarctic waters. The evening news would be very boring there. Nobody's getting attacked by a shark. There are no fish in Antarctica with crushing jaws. All 250 species of fish, which happen to have antifreezes in their blood, are wimps. They have weak little jaws and they feed on little crustaceans. Nothing like a parrotfish that you've heard crunching on a Caribbean reef on coral. Nothing like that. There's nothing with a claw. There are no crabs. There are no lobsters. So what this means is that this community that is very ancient has evolved in the absence of crushing predators. What does this mean? It means if I hand John a clam from Antarctica, he can take 2 fingers and crush the shell. Very weakly calcified. So you can imagine the shock to marine biologists when a colleague of mine, Sven Thatchy, in 2007 was flying a submarine along the seafloor below a ship. He's like a kid at the game, he's got this little stick. He's flying along the bottom. He's down at, 1,123 meters, pretty deep. He's at the base of the Antarctic slope, which leads to the shelf. And he comes across 13 king crabs. This had never been seen before, king crabs on the Antarctic slope. Why was this such a surprise to science? Because we knew king crabs lived in the deep sea around Antarctica, no surprise. But they'd never been seen on the slope because as you go up the slope, it gets colder. The sea gets colder as you go up. Crabs don't do cold. If they get too cold, they act like they're drunk. They fall over. They miss their mouth when they try to feed themselves. They have magnesium ions in their body fluid, in their blood, that go crazy at cold temperatures. It's like a narcotic. So, what might be happening is for the first time, as that huge current is beginning to warm, the physiological curtain is opening and crabs are moving up. Now you're thinking, big deal, we'll have a crab fishery. They're not particularly big crabs, but they're big enough to crush the animals that live on the seafloor. So it would be a very difficult situation if crabs get into the shelf. Now, I actually was involved in a very large study that went on for 7 years for the National Science Foundation. They gave us access to the ship. We did 3 cruises, about a month and a half each. We towed a submarine behind the ship that we leased from Woods Hole up the Antarctic slope and onto the shelf, taking pictures of the seafloor every 10 seconds. We amassed hundreds of thousands of images to analyze if the crabs were on the slope, had they reached the shelf, what were they feeding on, were they causing problems? And when you have a massive database as a scientist, you turn to a very important instrument called the graduate student. So we had our graduate students analyze all those pictures, and the story was, yes, the king crabs have arrived by the millions on the slope, but they have not reached the shelf, thankfully. So we'll have to follow that story. Now, John mentioned that we do drug discovery at our UAB program, and this is something that we're very proud of. And this is what's concerning to me, is having novel predators moving into this ecosystem could have a negative effect on species we haven't even had a chance to look at yet. Warming could influence their survival as well. I mean, we found this tunicate in our front yard, in front of the station. This animal that's on the same sort of part of the tree that we're on, a chordate, if you will, a Eurochordate called a tunicate. It has vertebrate-like characteristics when it's a baby, and then it changes into a blob. So it is a blob that happens to have a chemical that we named after the station we call palmirolide, and we sent it to the National Cancer Institute, and they screened it against 20 different types of human cancer cell lines, and they called us up. And they said, we're really excited about this chemical because it's very potent and it's only active against one type of cancer. We really like that. Can we work on it? And if you're in your lab at UAB and the NCI, the National Cancer Institute, calls you up and wants to work on your chemical, you say yes, absolutely. And so they use their own scientists to do the first obvious thing. And that is, if you're going to have a drug to fight cancer from Antarctica, you cannot go to Antarctica with a giant ship and harvest the seafloor. It's not going to work. So they made the chemical in the laboratory. That's not such a surprise. Most things can be made in the laboratory. The problem was 13 chemical steps. Drug company wouldn't like that. Too expensive. So we didn't give up. And since I've talked to you within the last few years probably, we've got a molecular biologist involved who has sequenced the gene cluster for the genes that make palmirolide. Imagine that technology. We know the gene sequence, and we can insert it in a bacteria and tell the bacteria to make a chemical that might be the next drug to fight melanoma skin cancer. That's really cool. So my point is, we don't want to squander this resource. We have literally just looked at the tip of the iceberg of the potential for drug development in Antarctica, and we don't want to lose that. So this is the point where I say, oh, you've just heard bad news. And I really believe that in Antarctica we can find stories of hope too. And that's what I want to share with you now, and it's a wonderful story. And I know some of the players. So in 1985, there was a technician and his colleagues sitting at their desk at an Antarctic station. And they looked at the data set and they said, you know, I don't think our boss in England is going to believe the data. And they sent it back to England, and the boss looked at the data and said, you're right, I don't believe the data. You're going back to Antarctica next year with a new spectrophotometer. You're going to do all this over again, and then let me know what you find out. And they found the same thing, and they could not believe that they had discovered a massive hole in our Earth's atmosphere over the entire continent of Antarctica. Remember, this is a continent the size of China and India combined. A massive hole that's so big that it would periodically float over New Zealand. And Fern and I happened to be living in New Zealand with our kids at the time, that you would look at the newspaper and it would tell you what level of sunscreen to put on that day because the hole in the ozone was over New Zealand or not. And they have the highest rates of skin cancer. One of the things about ozone in the atmosphere is it protects us from ultraviolet radiation. But a lot of people don't realize it also affects climate. The wind patterns below the hole were different than without the hole. So we had a global impact on our climate, we had a health issue, and then we had an amazing solution. Within 2 years of publishing this discovery in Nature, the most prestigious journal in the world, 20 countries sat down around a table in Montreal, Canada, and ratified the Montreal Protocol that regulated the chlorofluorocarbons, the refrigerants, that were destroying the ozone. It's amazing. Today, there are 191 signatories to the Montreal Protocol. It is, I think, the most successful global treaty ever. And even better, it has worked. The companies that made these things didn't go out of business. They used technology innovation to develop new types of refrigerants that didn't destroy the ozone. They didn't lose jobs. And the woman who discovered the chemistry behind the destruction of the ozone, Susan Solomon, who's at MIT, told me that the hole in the ozone is now thought to be closing mid-century instead of end of century. So it is a wonderful example of coming together and finding a common solution. Now I want to remind you, because a lot of people don't realize this, and this kind of goes nicely with John's final comments, his prose. Antarctica truly is connected to all of us, not just in a spiritual sense, but because physically the Antarctic circumpolar current is part of the global ocean conveyor belt. And that current is so dominant, and when it moves up into our Pacific and our Atlantic Ocean basins, it is a climate maker itself. So it is affecting our climate here in the United States. So the heavy rains we've been experiencing, the droughts, the deep colds, all these things that now are in our front yards could be related in part to what's happening in Antarctica. So it really is something that we have to keep in mind. So this was my moment. For me, it was a bit of an epiphany. And I realized that I wasn't going to just do research in Antarctica, basic research, or even drug discovery, applied research, but I was going to use Antarctica as my palette, if you will, to share the story of global climate change, because I was witnessing it personally, and I felt it was really important to share that story. And that was really one of the moments when I heard the water running under my feet. And I will stop there. Oh, wait. One more slide. This is where I just give my little preacher thing. All right. So, we have a choice. And I'm not going to belabor this. I'm just going to say that we have a choice because we have the technology. We have the technology. Think about that. We have to decide. We have the capacity to produce solar energy. We have the capacity to produce wind energy. Nuclear has become more friendly, if you will, smaller units, safer. Hydrogen, if you produce it from renewable energy, is another source of energy. We might even have fusion coming. I don't know if you followed that in the news. It's down the road, but wouldn't that be amazing? So we have the technology. It's just a question if we have the will. And that's what I want you to think about. Thank you.
In the Episcopal Book of Common Prayer, the most expansive language around the Eucharistic prayer is Eucharistic Prayer D. Now, we don't often use Eucharistic Prayer D, probably because it's about twice as long as A, B, or C. I'm very mindful of time when we worship. But if you want to know what we believe, I encourage you to read Eucharistic Prayer D. It's worth unpacking a few lines. One of the prayers begins, "Fountain of life and source of all goodness, you made all things and filled them with your blessing. You created them to rejoice in the splendor of your radiance." Later in the Eucharistic prayer, we acclaim you, Holy Lord, glorious in power. Your mighty works reveal wisdom and love. You formed us in your own image, giving the whole world into our care, so that in obedience to you, our Creator, we might rule and serve all your creatures. When our disobedience took us far from you, you did not abandon us to the power of death. In your mercy, you came to our help, so that in seeking you, we might find you. Again and again, you called us into covenant with you, and through the prophets you taught us to hope for salvation. I think that may be the reason that that there's these trips, and if you see in this trip, there's a couple of our parishioners, Raymond and Catherine Harbert went on this trip. I know from St. Luke's, y'all, Robert and Pam, y'all went last year. There's opportunities to marvel. Jim's leading a group every December, right before Christmas, and it's worth considering to be inspired, to be changed. I think the central tenets of the Christian faith explored in Eucharistic Prayer D are this: God has made all things and filled them with God's blessing, called us to rejoice in the splendor of your radiance. God has called us to serve and rule creation, and our disobedience has taken us far from God, and yet God still calls us back into relationship. Our hope tonight is that you see the blessing of our southernmost continent teeming with life and hope, and it might be one of the critical keys to our own thriving here on earth. To be inspired to care about God's blessing and to take seriously our commitment to not just rule, but to serve. It is a part of the human condition to disobey. The reason we haven't always cared for this home in the ways we're called to is precisely because we are human. And yet, the reason we gather as people of the faithful is to follow God's call to turn us around, to work and to do better. Grace gives us that opportunity to start over and over. We are in the Lenten season where we recognize the gift of God's grace that meets us in our disobedience and offers us a chance to strip down the excesses so that we can offer our whole lives to the glory of God. My hope is that you and I care not only for each other, but all of God's creation as a faithful response to God's love and inspiration. All that God has created is dependent on one another. And we are called to be caregivers of the sacred gift of life, the sacred gift of God's creation. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree and seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has breath of life, I have given you green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed, it was very good. Dominion comes with responsibility. What is yours to care for? Amen. So we have a little bit of time for questions. We also have several copies of Jim's book on Antarctica, which is brilliant. So if you'd like copies, he's happy to.
I'll have a St. Stephen special for $10, and that includes the $200 signature.
Comments, questions? Yeah, Mary? So we have a live stream. So Jim, I'm going to invite you up here. Yeah, just for those that may be tuning in remotely.
Our two mics might go at each other.
That's good. Yep.
The question was, how do we isolate things to see if they have activity against cancers? So what happens is we provide the chemical or a crude gamish of chemicals to the National Cancer Institute. And what they do is they look for the ability of the chemical to essentially stop cell growth. So instead of cells that are cancerous growing, you know, if that's what cancer is, right? Uncontrolled cell growth. And so they apply these drugs or these compounds in various concentrations and see if they can stop that uncontrolled growth, stop the cancer. So this particular compound from this tunicate only did that against melanoma, not against breast cancer, prostate cancer, and that's very unique when you find something that's just focused on one particular cancer. So, and the other thing is they eventually want to know what's happening. Why is it causing this reaction? And so that's something that they don't want to have another drug that does the same thing as something that's already on the market. So this particular compound has a different mode of action. So it's hopeful, I hope.
How did you know it was going to be for cancer and not something else?
Well, we take our compounds when we collect them from these organisms, and we send them to the National Cancer Institute, to the Cystic Fibrosis Research Center at UAB, to a number of pharmaceutical companies that test against bacteria, antibiotic, see if they have antibiotic potential. So they get run against a whole series. We have thousands of these compounds in a library. And somebody might say to us, you know, I'm trying to do something about leishmania, a parasitic disease that's affecting thousands in Africa. And we'll send them a little bit of our entire library, and they'll screen it to see if there's any activity. So it's kind of like having a resource that you can farm out. Yeah.
Well, is there any relationship to it being a drug for melanoma and the ozone?
Yes, yes. If you are under an area of the atmosphere that doesn't have ozone, your cells are being damaged. The DNA is being damaged. That's what causes melanoma. That's what causes other types of skin cancers. So yes, and that's one of the thoughts about having the ozone hole over New Zealand. For whatever reason, they have a very high incidence of skin cancer in New Zealand. There's a lot of concern about that. So getting the ozone hole back under control is a good thing. It stopped growing, and it should be gone, hopefully, mid-century. So yes, there is a direct correlation.
Yeah.
John, your last comment about humans, human nature.
Yeah.
So I would like to just kind of throw this out. Indigenous peoples, as I understand it, have not had the tendency to spoil the environment in which they live, in which, to the degree or any degree at all, as Western European-based humanity has done. So I see that there's a difference in understanding of our place in the world.
Yeah, thank you, Mary.
Being a part of it or over it.
So one thought is, so one of the reasons that I try to frame my talk in the way that I do is I think that Judaism and Christianity has a huge voice to contribute in a totally different ethic that most of us live. I think it is ingrained in there. And the word for Adam, we all know about Adam. Adam's not a name. God takes Adamah, which is a Hebrew word for the red clay, and breathes life into Adamah, and we have Adam. So there's this intimate connection to creation that is a part of our Judeo-Christian worldview that is often overlooked. And I think one of the risks is when we mistranslate language, or we don't understand the complexity of language, like dominion. If we think we can just do whatever we want to, because some tenets of Christianity are totally focused on salvation, and they miss the gift of life, and that God is calling us back into a garden and into a relationship with the other. I think you need both. Like, I'm not dismissing salvation, but if we're totally focused on the future. So I just say that Christianity, as Christianity has moved for some segments of Christianity to totally focus on salvation, if you just believe in Jesus, everything's taken care of, you miss the whole point of human life.
But I think there's a difference in cultures.
Correct.
Of indigenous cultures.
Yeah.
People.
Yeah.
That have respected this planet.
Absolutely.
And live versus European culture.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
what you say about, is it because it's the human condition that we do this,
But
or is it
yeah.
something else?
I would say, while indigenous groups have taken a better care of our earth, I am sure they do things that all of us rebel, right? That's just a human thing. They just maybe rebel in different ways. I mean, I don't want to speak for other people that's probably not my place, but all of us as humans, like, I mean, that's why all of us are drawn, I think, to Lent. Like, we know we screw up. Like, who has screwed up in the last 30 minutes? I have. Like, I'm trying to be funny. I made a comment. I just realized, wait a second, I just disparaged my aunt. I don't mean that. She was a brilliant scientist. Like, I'm just like, oh my God. And now I'm guilty, and I'm feeling like the shame that comes out of that. And like all of us, we make mistakes every single day. And part of our Christian faith is to turn around and try to do better. And if we don't see in how we treat other human beings, if we don't treat how people that are marginalized, if we don't treat, and I'm trying to make the claim that the earth is a part of that. Yeah. CJ.
I have a question about the comments you made about the fresh water now melting into the ocean. So my thought was, how does that affect the salinity of the ocean?
Good question.
And affect.
So the question is, as these glaciers melt, the meltwater is fresh, and it is. And so what happens is you do get these low salty, low saline areas around the base of the glacier. It can affect water currents because the density of the water is different when it doesn't have the salt in it. So you can have freshwater lenses of water, which could affect the marine life to some degree. But the fact is there's such a huge dilution factor in the size of the ocean compared to the meltwater coming into it that it's not going to cause a major disruption. But I do know colleagues, scientists, who are studying this very phenomenon, particularly in the Arctic, where you're seeing even more melting, even more water. You've seen probably the pictures of the moulins on top of Greenland, where you have these huge rivers disappearing into the base of the glacier and coming out at the ocean front. Those are more dramatic. It's shallower water. You've got fisheries like salmon that run up the rivers. That's a much more ecologically sensitive response area to that low salinity than Antarctica will be. Good question.
Mims? Yeah.
About closing the ozone, how many years did that take to get businesses to make those decisions, and was that worldwide, and how did all that come about?
It's quite remarkable, really. It happened within a decade or two. And the fact that they met within 2 years of this discovery is phenomenal. Most things take, forever before you get 20 countries to sit down around a table. The fact that there's 191 signatories now is indicative of the success. Now you're wondering, what about the poor countries that didn't have the technology to develop these refrigerants that are not destructive? So there was a program to provide funding to low-income countries to help them with the technology, or just provide them with the technology, so that it has been outsourced worldwide. So it is a global reaction. Now, of course, there's always a few cheaters, and I'm pretty sure that they can figure this out. There's some way, if they're releasing these things into the atmosphere, they have a signature that they can pick up from a satellite or something like this. So they can actually play a little detective work and do this. But apparently the cooperation level is very, very high, partly because the industry didn't suffer.
Kitty?
Is that drug used today to treat melanoma?
No, not yet.
Outside?
Not yet. It's a very, if everything went well, what would happen next would be we would get some financial backers to help us come up with the money to start testing this compound.
Is UAB using it, trying to do research on it?
In the sense that we're at UAB, yes. And we have worked with some of our colleagues there. University of South Florida is involved in this project, University of Arizona.
Kansas,
Right.
is involved with research.
If we got to the point where we were doing clinical trials with this compound, they might very well be a player in that. Yeah. And they're doing wonderful work. I've gotten to know a lot of the people in the cancer department, which is kind of odd for a marine biologist, but I now get invited to give talks on Antarctica and climate change at medical conventions. So I went to Orlando and I talked to 300 pediatric surgeons. You can imagine that. Let's see, who was the other guy on the stage with me? I think his name was Arnold Palmer. Yeah, I knew that guy. I know his name. But the medical world's very interested in learning about Antarctica, drug discovery. Usually when they go to their conferences, they don't want to hear about what they do. And so this is something you have to think outside the box about. So, yeah, so anyway.
You know, Ann? Yeah.
Did I understand you to say that there was pretty much worldwide consensus on the ozone issue within a couple of years?
Within a couple of decades.
In a couple of decades?
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of the problem now, is that we can't really get worldwide consensus on many other problems?
Well, carbon dioxide and methane are,
How did that happen?
yeah.
How did everybody?
Well, it was a, yeah, I think because it was a very concise issue that could be focused on, the technology could be developed. It didn't affect companies in the sense that they were going out of business. If you're producing oil and you can't use oil anymore, it's a different scenario than if you're producing a refrigerant and you're just going to make another one but still sell it. You see what I'm saying? So it's much more complicated. But we can do it. I think we have to. And the sooner the better.
More than anything, my hope is that you pay attention. So we have monthly holy hikes that will start March, the first Saturday in March. We have a progressive Eucharist, progressive in the sense of the Eucharist unfolds over the 3-mile hike. We have a Canucharis that we've done last couple of years in August. We have talks. We have lots of things happen here at St. Stephen's. If you have not looked out in the memorial garden at the daffodils blooming, just pay attention to this gift that we have. It's beautiful. Part of the reason I think of having to do the memorial garden campaign was 200-year storms in 2 years that picked up all the bluestone and made that unnavigable. We hadn't really talked about that, but the weather is more extreme today. I think you know that. We may not want to admit it. We may not want to accept responsibility.
As you
for
talk
it.
about climate change with family
Yeah.
and friends, the best thing to do is to not preach. What you want to do is you want to find common ground. You want to talk about when the tomatoes are ripening. You want to talk about the birds on the feeder, the fact that the creek bed across from you is eroding now that the rains are heavier. Don't tell somebody to go buy a Prius. That's not the way. Find common ground.
Yeah.
And for reading purposes, I might mention Catherine Hayhoe, who was in town recently. She is the head scientist for the Nature Conservancy. I'm on the board of the Alabama Nature Conservancy, but she mainly came not to see the Nature Conservancy as much as to talk at Samford. And think about that. Southern Baptist College invites climate change scientists to speak. But she's an evangelical Christian. She's been to Oral Roberts and spoken about climate change. She has a wonderful book she just published. So Catherine Hayhoe, if you want to learn about climate change and how to think about it, very gentle, very informative.
Yeah.
It's a good read.
It's like last question from Diane, and then we'll.
I don't know if it's a question as much as an observation. I have been fortunate enough to be a scuba diver, and I know what's happening to coral reefs. And that's another thing, if we can just get people to understand that these are nurseries for fish.
Absolutely.
These are just, they're mind-blowing in their beauty and color.
The coral reefs are responsible for many billions of dollars in global fisheries. And maybe some of you read that the Florida Keys had over 100-degree temperature waters this past summer. And it was sad to me because I know some of the coral biologists that are working down there. And they went to look at their experiments in the field. They had put out thousands of little sprigs to get them established. And 90% of them were dead because they just can't take that kind of heat. They didn't even bleach. They didn't turn white and lose their symbionts. They literally died within hours. So, yes. And if you've ever been on a coral reef, wow, what an amazing experience.
And just, I don't think you were clear about this. Jim's research is scuba diving in Antarctica. Scuba diving in Antarctica.
Under ice. At least
Yeah,
early on in
nice.
my career, we would have to drill through 10 feet of ice to get into the water.
Yeah.
But talk about the most beautiful place. It's like you're drifting down through the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. I mean, it is absolutely stunningly blue, and you can see 500 feet underwater. It's crystal clear. I mean, you got your tears in your eyes the first time you drop below the ice. And so it wasn't a hard place to be in terms of its beauty and its science. It was my fingertips and my toes and trying to get my wife to understand why I was doing this.
Thank you all for being here tonight.
Good job.